Abbott's Bitters is a much pursued recipe, partially because of its popularity as a cocktail ingredient back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, partially because of their legal trouble with Angostura bitters, and then there's the apocryphal tale that it was the first bitters used in the Manhattan cocktail. The history of this bitters is really interesting, so sit back, I'm going to tell you a story, and we're going to make these bitters today. I'm Darcy O'Neill, this is Art of Drink. Today we are going to make Abbott's Bitters from scratch, but the more important part is we're going to compare it to the sample of Abbott's Bitters that's 80 to 100 years old. And it was sent to me by Robert Hess probably 8 years ago when I first started this adventure. And we're going to compare it to the stuff we make it today, but also the stuff I made 9 years ago. So that's been aging for 9 years. And it should give us, a good understanding of whether this is the actual recipe or not. But before we get to that, I need to share with you the whole history of this, because if you're going to make an assessment on whether you believe this is Abbott's or not, you need to know everything I know. So I'm going to tell you the whole history and everything I have. My part of the story starts back in 2009. Bitters were all the rage and everybody's making their own bitters and looking at old recipes, and I was too. And I was going through an old patent database where I discovered that they did actually have bitters recipe, probably about 80 to 100 different recipes. And as I was browsing it, I came across this one, and it's called German Bitters, and it's from 1869, and it's by W.P. and John Haupert of Canton, Ohio. And the thing that struck me about it was that there was no toxic ingredients in it. It was actually one that I could make. So what you'll find is in a lot of these old bitters recipe, there is a tendency to use things that we won't use today. So when I came across this recipe, I mostly noticed that it was, a good list of ingredients. But down at the bottom, the witnesses on the patent were Job and Ruth Abbott. Now, we all know about Abbott's Bitters, or if you've read the old Drink Boy forums or any of the history stuff, you'll recognize that name. And I thought to myself, what's the chance of an Abbott being on a bitters recipe from about the time period that Abbott started? So that's what started my journey into figuring this out. And the first thing I had to do was figure out whether this Job Abbott was anybody important. And luckily it was pretty easy to find the information, because he is a member of the Canadian Business Hall of Fame. And the reason for that was that he was an engineer and he studied at Harvard. So there's lots of biographical information on Job Abbott. But beyond being an engineer and working in Toronto and Montreal, he was a patent lawyer back in the 1860s. So he wasn't the witness on this, he was the patent lawyer that filed this. And so having lots of information on Job Abbott, if I looked in the genealogy data, which I did, I found that he was a cousin to C.F. Abbott. So C.W. Abbott is the guy recognized as running the Abbott's company. But his father was in the business, and he was C.F. Abbott, and the son, Junior, was C.W. Abbott. And C.F. Abbott, the senior, had been making bitters since 1865, and he was just dabbling in it, but he made a bitters called Morningstar Bitters. Once I found the family connection, it kind of led me further that first I got to take a look at this recipe that was presented on the patent and see if it's close to what we know Abbott's is. Now, I didn't have a sample of Abbott's at the time, but on the old Drink Boy forums, there was a guy named Kevin, and he worked for, I believe, a perfume company, but he took a sample of old Abbott's and he ran it through a GC mass spec. Now, you can't recreate a formula from this chemistry data, but it does give you a fingerprint. It basically tells you what's in it, not necessarily the quantities. But everything that was in that original sample of Abbott's data could be accounted for in this recipe. I took this information, I emailed it out to a bunch of cocktail historians like Robert Hess, Ted Hay, Dave Wondrich, Gary Regan, and everybody got back to me with whatever they had. Not everybody had lots of information, but Ted Hay had the most amazing information. And he was fairly enthusiastic in his email when he said, wait till you see what I have. And what he had was an interview with the family from 2002. So Ted actually was looking for this recipe a long time ago. And he took it upon himself and he went and interviewed the family. Now, none of the family members actually worked at the Abbott's factory. It had closed down by 1955. but some of their parents did. And so the stories were passed along. So the Abbott's family story goes like this. Somewhere between 1869 and 1872, C.W. Abbott, the Jr., sent his father, C.F. Abbott, to Washington to the patent office for business purposes. And while he was in the waiting room, waiting to do whatever he was doing, he met a guy who had been waiting there for days to file a patent on his bitters. Now, C.F. Abbott started talking to him and went back and talked to C.W. Abbott about acquiring these bitters. And they made a deal to buy these bitters, or this bitters recipe, before the gentleman had filed it. Now, there's a couple things about this story that stand out. A, what are the chances of me doing research in 2009 and ending up at the patent office with this patent, and then Ted Hay doing research in 2002 and ending up at the patent office as well? There's something unique and interesting about that. And then the next step is, you never had to go to the patent office to file a patent. You just mail it in. Your lawyer would fill it out and mail it in, and then the patent clerks would do their thing. So there's no real reason to sit in the waiting room to file a patent. And the other thing is that in 1869, C.W. Abbott would have been 14 years old. So he wasn't bossing his dad around. So there's something to this, and partially because we also know that the Abbott Sr. was making Morningstar bitters before this. So there's something about the story that doesn't add up, but to me, my theory is that they were trying to hide that they had actually had a patent for the bitters. It's not like today where you can go online and Google something. You can actually go check out all these patents at patents.google.com, and you can search through decades and centuries of patents. But back then, you'd actually have to go to the patent office and have a patent clerk look it up for you. So the reason you filed the patent back in the 1800s was so that you weren't infringing on somebody else's invention. So you'd prepare your patent, the patent clerks would compare it to everything on that category, and then if you got the patent, you were safe. And it's doesn't really work that way today, but that's why people filed patents back then. But the problem was they expired, and once they expired, anybody could create them. So I suspect there was some kind of attempt to hide the fact that these were patented bitters and the recipe was laid out. At this point, we have the GC mass spec data, we have a family relationship, we have Ted Hay's research. Also, the patent states that the bitters were bottled at 50% ABV, and the actual Abbott's bitters are bottled at 50% ABV historically. And the patent also says that these bitters improve with age. And if you see any of the old Abbott's marketing, that was very predominant in their marketing material, that they were aged bitters. So there's lots of correlations here, and the only way to figure it out was to actually reproduce this recipe. Most of the ingredients are really easy to get. However, one ingredient called cannella, which is actually white cinnamon or cannella alba or Cannella winteriana, is very difficult to get. The trees actually went on the endangered species list, though in the early 1900s, this bark was being imported into the United States at 170,000 tons per year. So there was a massive amount of quantity of this bark coming into the United States from the Caribbean. And eventually, by the 1920s, it became very hard to get. And that kind of correlates with a known formula change in the Abbott's bitters. They changed their label to highlight these 4 ingredients, which instead of using cannella today, we're going to use these 4 ingredients, which are listed on the Abbott's bottles. And once we get into making the bitters, I'll explain why these 4 work. This element of getting the bark, I can't get it commercially. So, talking to some fellow bartenders in 2011, Jesse Card, who was living in the U.S. Virgin Islands at the time, found me a small sample of bark, and he brought it to Tales of a Cocktail. I made a small batch of bitters, and it tasted pretty good. What I did in 2012 was fly down to the U.S. Virgin Islands, and Jesse and I went around and harvested bark, drank at bars, harvested bark, hung out at the beach, drank, and did more drinking and bark harvesting. It's a tough job. But then I came back and reproduced this complete bitters recipe at Dillon's Distillery in Niagara Falls. And again, there are so many people that helped along the way. Like this was, I may be quarterbacking this, but without all the help that I've gotten from the people who provided information and did some legwork, this would have never been done. So part of the reason I'm giving this away is because so many people helped me. It just deserves to be out there. So I reproduced this. I produced 1 barrel, and that was going to be it. There's only maybe 8 to 10 liters left. And we're gonna make the bitters today, and we're just changing these ingredients for the canala bark, and we'll see how it turns out. So let's get making the bitters. So bitters are typically a tincture, and a tincture is just a less concentrated formula than, let's say, an extract. However, I'm going to be using an extract method today, partially because the patent tends to be, the method is closer to this method than just macerating in a big jar. And if you haven't seen anything on this device called a percolator, they're easy and cheap to get, and they work really, really well. But you can go check out this video up here on how to make an extract. And there's also a video on how to make a tincture, so check that out as well. And then that will give you all the background on this. The recipe has technically 6 ingredients, but one of them is being split into 4. And the canala bark, the reason why these 4 ingredients, at least chemically, it seems to match up, is that they were trying to replace the cinol or cyanol in canala bark. And that's one of the predominant flavor compounds in that bark. And all of these have varying amounts of it. And cardamom is probably the closest to the aroma of the bark. And you get a little bit of spiciness in the bark. So these are probably a good match for it. So let's start down here with the recipe first. You're gonna need 12 grams of anise seed. You're gonna need 6 grams of bitter orange peel. You're gonna need 12 grams of fennel seed. You're gonna need 12 grams of chamomile and 6 grams of gentian. And then 3 grams of cinnamon, 3 grams of cardamom, 3 grams of ginger, and 3 grams of clove. And that is basically your herbs and spices. Now, if you're using the percolator method, you can grind this up. And again, the benefit of using this is it only takes 48 hours to make your bitters, and they come out nice and clean. So this is a sample I made a while ago. It's basically clear and bright. And that's because this is a self-filtering method. But we're gonna take our anise seed, we're gonna take our bitter orange, and again, I just use a standard coffee grinder, some fennel seeds, chamomile, and this stuff's quite fluffy, so you might need to push it down just to get everything in there. And then we're gonna put in the gentian bark. We don't need to grind those up because those are already ground up, but we're just gonna give this a spin. The important step is to put this in a bowl and moisten it. That'll help make the extraction easier. Now, for alcohol, if you can find Everclear, the actual recipe calls for corn high wine, and I do have a still, so I make my own. But if you can't find high-proof Everclear, Canadian whiskey will work just fine. In fact, I think Canadian whiskey probably works a bit better because they do call for these bitters to be aged, and the aging process is done in an oak barrel. Bourbon's probably too strong for this, but Canadian whiskey's perfect. It's lightly oaked and it's got a fairly neutral flavor, which is what you want for this. But for my purposes, I'm gonna use the corn high wine here. And when you moisten this stuff, you do not want any puddles in there. You just want to get it damp. Then you're just gonna let this sit for about an hour. And with 60 grams of material here, you're only gonna need about 30 to 40 mils of your alcohol to moisten this. So now if you're doing the maceration method, you don't need to grind your herbs and spices so fine because that just makes a filtering mess. All you need to do is crush them up a bit, maybe with a mortar and a pestle. That's probably your best bet. Then put them in a large jar, put all the alcohol in there, and let them sit for 2 weeks. And then that will get most of the extraction out. This method, again, I just do it because it's quick and I like it, and it produces actually really good results with really clear solution. With maceration, you may get cloudiness or a haziness, and that's fine. It doesn't really change the flavor of the bitters. So once this has been sitting for an hour and it's kind of, everything's moist, there's no dry powder, you're just gonna basically pack your percolator. Now that this has been sitting for an hour, we're just gonna pack it into the percolator. It's pretty easy, you just need to... So once you have this set up, it's ready to go. And basically you're just gonna add your alcohol to this and you just simply fill this up. Make sure your stopcock's open. And you're just gonna let this percolate through. And if you see, you'll see that it's going down. Once it gets to the bottom, you're gonna close it up. The best way for this is to allow it to sit for maybe 4 hours with this alcohol in it, and then start draining it off slowly and then replacing the alcohol so that you get basically an alcohol refresh after 4 hours. Let it sit for till the next day, drain it off and refresh the alcohol again. And then do that once more in 48 hours and you'll have a full and complete extract on this. If you're liking this video, you can do me a favor by liking and subscribing or sharing this on Twitter or Facebook or wherever you hang out on social media. There is a lot more of this stuff to do, and it is quite interesting and I'd love to keep doing this. So I've already made a batch here and it's pretty much clear. The only thing we need to do at this point is to add some caramel coloring and some sugar. And you need 36 grams of sugar and caramel coloring just to color. You can actually probably skip the caramel coloring. I'm not sure if that's gonna... Typically it is an emulsifier, so it does help keep the oils in solution. And it is fairly stable, though we will find that when we try these bitters at the end, they are red, and this one will stay brown, or at least this one will stay brown. And that's because I used an acid-stable modern caramel, whereas what they would have used in the late 1800s would have just been burnt sugar, and that's not necessarily stable. So it will drop out. And in this, you can see there is a sediment. I don't know if you can see it, but there is a sediment in there. That's most likely the dropped out caramel. So just like making simple syrup, you just add your sugar. You can add water to it, but I do try to use alcohol just to keep the proof up on this. Again, this is Canadian whiskey. It's gonna be 40%. So you might get a little haze, but if you can find 50% ABV, it's gonna probably come out clearer, but it's not gonna affect the flavor whether it's hazy or not. It may take a few minutes to get this caramel coloring into solution because it just dissolves a little bit slower in alcohol, but it will dissolve. And I've put the caramel coloring in there already, and you can just basically pour it straight into the bottle. So I added about a tablespoon or two of the caramel coloring, and that will basically help stabilize the oils that you've extracted into the solution. And it doesn't necessarily change the flavor, but it does change the color. It does make it definitely a darker color. And because we're looking for 1 liter, we need to top this up to near the liter mark. And if you use known bottles, it's pretty easy. So there we have 1 liter of Abbott's bitters. And now we'll have to do the taste test to see how they came out. You can smell them. They're quite aromatic, but what they're not is super bitter. That's just kind of a known fact. When I actually tried to get mine approved in Canada, they weren't bitter enough. So if you're looking at recreating these, I don't think they'll actually pass through government approval because they're not super bitter. So here is the original old bottle of Abbott's. And actually, I'm going to use the 9-year-old Abbott because it's aged a little longer. And that's going to give us a closer, not necessarily close comparison, but a better comparison. One of the things you do get on this is vanilla. And one of the things with anise oil is that it will oxidize and form a vanilla-like compound. Ted Bro and I, he's the maker of Jade Absinthe, have had a conversation about this. And he agrees that absinthe can develop vanilla aromas over a long period of time. And it's just because the anise oil is breaking down and it forms these vanilla-like compounds. So that's one thing that you recognize right off the bat. Now, you can taste the licorice in there, that licorice flavor from anise and fennel. They're not super bitter. There is an astringency to it. And they are sweet. There is a sweetness to them. And that's, again, another clue. Not all bitters have sugar in them. Give these ones a shot. Now, the aroma on these is different. There's more vanilla in there. This one has far more anise. They're not that far apart. They both have the same kind of finish. They both have the same level of sweetness, and they both have the same level of bitterness. There is a difference, but this one has 80 to 100 years of age on this one. But I could easily see this developing into this. And again, we don't know whether the Abbotts changed the recipe at some point or used a completely different recipe. But these two, they're more similar than they are different. But either one of these would work great in a drink. So that's all I have on Abbotts. That's everything I know. This is how to make it. It's simple, so feel free to make them at home. You don't need much in the way of ingredients. And they are, whether they are Abbotts or not, I'll leave that up to you to decide. I personally believe they are. So there you go. Go out, buy your ingredients, and make some bitters today. And if we have to call them Haupert German bitters, that's fine with me, because we may never know that they're Abbott's bitters, but we do know that the Hauperts invented these in 1869. So we can just call them Haupert's bitters if we want. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.